Today we have the car up on jack stands behind me because now that the season's over, it's time to switch the car out of race mode and into winter mode. The winters here in Colorado do get pretty cold. We do dip down to the freezing temps just a little bit. Not as badly as you do in the Midwest or in the Northeast, but we do still get below 32 degrees Fahrenheit here. So we're gonna go through the car and get everything prepped for the winter here. Now when it comes to winterizing our car, the first thing we tend to do is drain as much water out of the car as we can. And that's simply just because we do use just water with a little bit of water wetter in it to help lubricate the water pump, but none of that has any freeze protection below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Now those of you that run engine ice are protected down to minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. And those of you that use the liquid performance from the Legend car dealers can go all the way down to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. But for us, we just run the water, so we gotta drain it before it even reaches the freezing temps. Some people we know that run just water will typically drain the water out and fill the system back up with some coolant over the winter, but we're personally gonna leave it dry this winter, so we're not gonna be doing that today. Now, if you know you're not gonna be turning the car on at all throughout the winter, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and fog the motor. All you gotta do is either get a fogging oil or use what we like to use is some Marvel's Mystery Oil, and obviously you're gonna wanna remove the spark plug, but you'll spray the oil down into this hole in each cylinder, turn the motor over for a little bit, let it lubricate the cylinder walls so that over the winter it doesn't corrode with it sitting still. And if you do get into those sub-zero temps, it's not a bad idea to try and insulate the motor as best as you can. Just throw a thick, heavy blanket over it. You know, you could use a moving blanket or anything that you have really. The main goal with insulating it is just to keep the frost from forming whenever you get to those sub-zero temps, because the last thing you want is any moisture inside the motor, and that'll definitely cause corrosion, because if the motor is not turning over and splashing the oil around inside the crankcase, then any type of moisture can cause it to rust, and that's definitely something you want to avoid over winter. Now the next thing we're gonna wanna do is pull all of the shocks off of all four corners on the car, just to kind of help save them a little bit, keep them from having any of that unnecessary stress put on them or any of that sag from the weight of the wheels. So typically what we like to do is take some old radius rods here and get them set up to where they're about the same ride height as what the shocks are under load, so that you can pull the shocks off and put these on in replacement. And it would not only save the shocks from unnecessary wear, but it'll also get your suspension kind of sitting at the correct ride height, no matter whether it's in the air or on the ground. That way you can make whatever adjustments to your setup you feel like you need to, and you can visually see it without having to put it on the ground. Now we are obviously going to do this with all four corners. All we do is load up the shock, measure from the center of the bottom bolt to the top bolt. It doesn't have to be a perfect measurement. In fact, ours are pretty rough, but as long as we get it pretty close, it's not a big deal. And then once you get a pretty decent measurement from that, you can go ahead and set up your old radius rods, and then once the radius rod is set up, you can go ahead and bolt it to the car. And as you can see, when it's bolted to the car, we do have the camber that it usually has at ride height, and all of our caster alignments and everything are all where it's supposed to be. So this is not only a great setup tool, but it's also great for prolonging the life of your shocks, especially if you got the new AFCOs and don't actually know what the longevity of these are yet. So now that we're finished with the shocks, we're gonna move on to our tires. Now for the off season, it doesn't really matter what the weather is. The biggest thing is you really need to make sure that the car is not gonna be sitting in the same spot on the tires as best as you can. If you don't really have a choice and you do have to leave the car on the tires, make sure you try and roll the car around every week or so. Make sure the tires are always inflated. You really wanna try and avoid getting a flat spot with these tires, because they are pretty soft compared to a street tire. So the longer they sit in the same spot, the more susceptible to flat spotting it would be. Now these Hoosiers do not like the cold, and if you're like me and you live in an area where it gets below freezing, you really need to take care of them if you plan on using them on a track ever again. It's important to make sure that these stay taken care of, because these tires are susceptible to freeze cracks. The best way to avoid freeze cracks is to get the tires into an insulated environment as best as you can. For us, we don't have any insulation in our garage, so we do have to bag these and bring them inside. One of the things you could do is put them in a big black plastic bag, you know, one of the contractor trash bags. Bring them inside if where you're storing the car is not insulated, you know, whether it be the basement or just somewhere inside. I've also seen many people wrap these in a type of pallet wrap, or some people go through the effort to go through and get the specific tire wraps that some people use whenever you go through and treat tires. And if you happen to still have Federals and have a tire machine, you could always throw the old Federals on. That way you could just take the tire inside and still be able to roll the car around, but the tire doesn't get damaged from all the freezing. And if for whatever reason you can't take care of your tires in any way that I just stated before, you can always just drain the air out of them and put them in a stack off to the side. The biggest thing with freeze cracks is you don't want to stress them out whenever it does get to that temperature. So as long as there's no air in them and you're not pushing around on the sidewalls or anything like that while it's frozen, it's not really going to be a big deal. But you want to make sure that whenever you decide to fill those tires back up or mount them or whatever you're going to do, Hoosier recommends that you wait until it's at least 70 degrees for a 24-hour period so that the tires can come up to what they call room temperature. Now that's just what Hoosier recommends about storing your tires. I'll link their winter safety bulletin down in the description in case you wanted to read over it and see how you can care for your tires during the winter. But we are lucky enough to have the Federals that came with our first car, so we're gonna probably dismount these, throw those on there, and then throw these into a plastic bag and then take them inside so that they're still usable for next year. And now it's time for us to finally make our way to the rear of the car. So now the two major things to do while you're back here, aside from all the shock and tire stuff that we've been talking about, you want to make sure your battery stays on some type of charger or tender throughout the winter, because these batteries, depending on where you get yours from, tend to drain fairly quickly in freezing temperatures, and a lot of them don't like not being used, so you want to make sure you try and get those taken care of as best as you can. And then finally, we're going to drain the fuel out of our fuel cell. It might be slightly difficult to see, but we are probably about half to 3/4 full after our last feature for the year. So our plan right now is to just pull that fitting off and let it drain into a drip pan that we have. Obviously the system is not pressurized right now because it hasn't been started since our last event, but we are going to make sure to go through and drain everything out. Now if you don't have that fitting at the bottom of your fuel cell because you do have an older model, or you have the metal one that just doesn't have the bottom one at all, there are other ways for you to drain your fuel. The best way to do it is probably just going to be by trying to manually pump it out, whether you siphon it or, you know, do something out of the tank itself. Another way you can do it, but I wouldn't personally recommend, is to have a switch that runs to the fuel pump specifically and just have that constantly running, so you can pull your fitting off right here where the throttle body is and have it just go straight into a fuel container. It's important to have all of your fuel stored in airtight containers so that not only does it not evaporate from all the vapor getting out, but also so it doesn't go stale from all the moisture and vapor getting into it from the atmosphere. So you always want to try and make sure to keep your fuel in a container that can handle it. Now, winterizing your legend car is not necessarily a super difficult task. In fact, most of the things we covered today you can do for a 1250 as well. You know, you can fog the motor, you can cover it with a blanket to make sure there's no frost, take all of your shocks off, do everything. It doesn't really matter. The only thing you're not going to do with the 1250 is obviously drain all the water out of it, because the 1250 is an air-cooled motor. But it is very important that you still put in the effort to try and take care of your car over the winter, because the last thing you want to do is show up to your next event and either you have a blowout or your motor starts leaking water because you ended up leaving water in there over the winter and it just busted out a freeze plug or popped a line. So now there's a lot of you that go through this every single year with your legend car and probably don't even need to be watching this video, but if you know someone who's relatively new to the sport and are having trouble getting started on winterizing their car, or what all it takes, then go ahead and send this video their way. I'd greatly appreciate it. But that's all we have for now. I definitely appreciate you guys watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one.